success, and experience. Representing people in hundreds of jury trials, Nathaniel Lee is who you want by your side in the courtroom. You've seen the rest, now hire the best. Contact Lee, Cosell, and Feigley today. And now, to address the legal concerns of the community, Praise AM 1310, 95.1 FM presents Legally Speaking. Here are today's hosts.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our show again. I'd like to thank our listeners in New York and Chicago and Atlanta. Thank you also for sending the texts and notices. I thank you for supporting our show each week. Today we have a superstar panel with attorney Vanita Banks, research analyst, lawyer, master's in tax, cyber security expert, and Marlon Prime, who formerly served for the Justice Department. Now some people call it the Injustice Department. Thought I'd get to do it. Then we have a special guest, Dr. Patrick Rooney. He's professor of economics and philanthropic studies and executive associate dean for academic program at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Previously, as executive director of the school's predecessor, the Center on Philanthropy. He worked on the faculty board, and he's a superstar in his field. And we brought him on the show specifically because he's an expert in economics. And as we see our national economy collapse right in front of our eyes, maybe we can make some sense out of it with somebody explaining to us exactly what the heck is going on. Dr. Rooney, how are you doing today, sir?
Great, Nathaniel. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we got some tariffs that was imposed by Donald Trump, the current president of the United States. And the tariffs, I saw that there were 6 countries that was inhabited by penguins and bears and stuff that imposed tariffs. So this widespread tariffs that unfold, explain to us what a tariff is and why does it affect the economy so much?
Sure. And so I'll try to be brief through the history of this, and then we can talk more about the effects of it in more detail. But, so one thing just to be clear was that tariffs as an idea have been around for centuries. And in fact, the United States had tariffs at the beginning of its founding for many, many decades and centuries because early presidents wanted to give our own manufacturers and businesses a competitive edge and allow us to, particularly to fight off the British economically and especially in manufacturing. And so the general idea behind tariffs is to raise revenue for the government, to restrict imports and protect domestic producers from foreign competition, and sometimes to use it as leverage to negotiate reciprocity or fairness among trading partners. In the early days, even in the early days, some presidents and some economists argued about the infant industry argument that you protect a new business in a country to allow the United States to catch up to the rest of the world. And so, well, that kind of ignores the advice of free trade that many Republicans embrace today and many economists embrace today. It was kind of the norm for many decades and centuries. Woodrow Wilson, when he was president, planned to lower tariffs as a priority, but then World War I revised trade policies, and then following World War I, Democrats lowered tariffs in 1913, but Republicans imposed protective tariffs when they returned to power in 1921. And some of you may have heard the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. It's been bandied about more recently. And some economists and some politicians think that that was the cause of the Great Depression, and others would argue that it was at least made it worse. And I would say, whether you think it was the cause or made it worse, imports and exports to and from the United States fell by about 2/3, 67%, and unemployment tripled from 8% to 25% shortly after Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was imposed. And so you got to say there may not be causation, but there certainly is some correlation. One interesting note is that Presidents Reagan, President Bush, the first one, and President Clinton all pushed for lower tariffs, and that remains sort of the dominant form in the post-World War II period until Donald Trump in his first term. And so Donald Trump has had this agitation about tariffs since time immemorial for him. In his first term, he imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum and on many goods from China, 25% on many goods from China. JP Morgan, which most of you have heard of, large banking entity, they estimated that Trump's first steel tariff added 1,000 steel jobs. That sounds great, but it cost 75,000 jobs in steel using industries. So it protected U.S. Steel and some other steel manufacturers, but it hurt Ford, Chrysler, GM, and a lot of the other industries that used steel. While factory jobs overall increased 0.4%, total jobs in that period fell 2%. So it cost us a lot to save a few jobs is, the main point. This time around, some facts and figures from, this time around, President Trump established a 10% minimum baseline tariffs across the board, including countries that have no tariffs against us, and very steep increases on many countries, including a 34% increase on China. Taiwan and Vietnam got hit by over 30%. Thailand got hit by over 30%, and the list goes on. And as Nathaniel Lee referred to earlier in the show, they hit some island where there's no human beings apparently, and so I don't think we need to worry too much about the penguins and that. It's already been announced that China has responded with a 34% tariff on all American goods. This, I think, is reminiscent of the trade wars and the Great Depression, where it's kind of a tit for tat. The immediate effects following the 2025 tariffs have been devastating. The S&P 500 lost almost 10% of its value in 2 days following the announcement. Now, the last time we had a big precipitous drop like that happened at the start of COVID in 2020, which was an exogenous shock, right? There was a pandemic. And then we had a big drop in 2008 during the financial crisis driven by predatory mortgage practices. And then in 1973-74 from OPEC-induced oil embargo. All those other ones were exogenous shocks. This one seems to be entirely self-inflicted. It's been estimated that it will cost the average family $2,100 more per year to buy the exact same goods with these tariffs than it would have without them. How are people reacting? Well, Volkswagen said they're going to add a line item on their sticker to show the price of the tariffs, just because they want to be clear that they're passing that along. The Federal Reserve Board Chair, Chairman Powell, expressed yesterday concerns that these tariffs would likely lead to higher inflation and slower growth. And it's pretty hard for the Federal Reserve Board to cut interest rates, as President Trump was ordering them to, if they're dealing with fears or the reality of stagflation, that is, rising prices and falling production. The loss of $2.5 trillion on the stock market on the day following the announcement and over $6 trillion by the second day it's pretty devastating for a lot of people, leaving a lot of people wondering where to run, where to hide, where to recover. One economist forecast a 10% hit in GDP in the second quarter of this year, as well as higher prices in the face of slower growth. JP Morgan said the risk of a recession went up from 15%, which was the norm, to 60%. So it's over 50% likely that JP Morgan thinks we'll have a recession this year, as well as an increase in the consumer price index by 2%. One of the, if you watched TV last night or the last couple of nights, the business reporter for CNBC said this was a self-inflicted vandalism, was the word he used. The chief economist at UBS Global Wealth said the U.S. isn't sneezing like it's called a cold, it's hacking off one of its limbs. And they have also characterized this as the largest tax increase outside of World War II and the Vietnam War. So clearly, there's some problems. And, one of the things one of my brothers says is that there's wisdom in the knowledge of the masses. And I would say, given that all of the markets have tumbled dramatically in the 2 days following the announcements, the collective wisdom, the collective knowledge is that most individuals and corporations don't believe this has been a great idea. So, in conclusion, there's always been tariffs, and but I think that there's opposition to the imposition of large tariffs in a punitive manner against our allies as well as our adversaries around the globe using a sledgehammer approach. Many would have supported tariffs used with a more scalpel-like precision to signal that some trade practices or the theft of intellectual property rights can't be tolerated and something should be done about that. But the effort to fight our allies and our enemies at once with the same manner risks creating new alliances among our allies and enemies working against the United States, not with us. Free trade is supposed to be mutually beneficial, and it's widely believed that nobody wins in a trade war. And with that, I will pause for your questions and comments.
Attorney Banks.
Thank you so much, Professor Rooney. I really appreciate your words regarding tariffs. One of the things I wanted to ask is what's motivating these tariffs on behalf of the president and those of us that are trying to understand these tariffs as a prudent economic policy at this time, just don't get it. It seems like these tariffs are a tool to are being weaponized to actually collapse our democracy. And they're being used as a means to compel loyalty ultimately for every business that may need to petition the administration for relief. And that these tariffs really aren't designed to function as an economic policy, but they are just a dangerous political tool that's being used at this point. And so I'm just wondering, about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Vanita, so some great questions, and I'll try to answer them briefly. One of the things that was fascinating to me, and I had, because Donald Trump has been around and prognosticating for decades before anybody really paid attention to him. And so last night on the news, they were, showing clips of him 20, 30 years ago railing about, unfair trade practices and in favor of tariffs. And it's clear to me now that this is something that he's been like he had this answer and he wanted to impose it. And in the first term, his advisors didn't let him get very far, still had some harm. But now he's going all in on the first day. And one of the commentators said, perhaps consistent with his need to have doing the art of the deal and people coming to him and only him, as he would say, that he is creating a begging economy where businesses have to beg him for exemptions, where other countries have to come and beg him for a special deal, have to beg him to relent on these tariffs. And so we're moving from an international global economy where the governments kind of try to stay out of the way and let businesses and consumers sort things out to this, kind of feudal-like economy where you have the king of the manor and people come begging to him for forgiveness and for special favors. And while that might be hyperbolic sounding, it's not inconsistent with some of the other approaches President Trump has taken.
Attorney Grimes, Prime.
Well, hey, good morning. Thank you for being part of the program today. Couple of questions for you. Number one, there's so much misinformation out there regarding tariffs and just the economy in general. So my question is, for those in the audience that want to get reliable information, are there any sources that you would recommend so that those that may not have the background and training that you have can get reliable information not only about tariffs but about the economy? And I have a follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. One of the things, I personally try to do when there's these big announcements is to consume information from lots of sources. And so, I intentionally watch CNN and Fox and NBC and read the newspapers and go on the web and look at different sources. And so, it was fascinating. Of course, CNN was lambasting President Trump about these things and had all sorts of facts and figures and so on. And Fox said, I was telling my wife last night, Fox had this amazing thing where all their commentators were saying, well, who cares about our 401ks? I believe in President Trump. He's the man. And so, it was kind of a shift from the news to this great leap of faith. And as St. Francis would say, we have to have this great leap of faith towards our leader. And so it was a very different experience, I think. And I think if you looked on NBC and CBS last night and in the last couple nights, you saw a much more moderated version, but something that looked much more like what was being reported on CNN, that this is having a very deleterious, calamitous effect on the economy, on the stock market. And for a lot of people, one of the themes that really bounced out to me was, as someone who has just retired recently from full-time work, that what do you do when you see your 401k plummeting? And one of the things, if you're a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old or 40-year-old, you just keep plowing ahead, right? And there'll be lots of business cycles ahead of us and so on. And I mentioned to my wife that, I think, the bad news is you hate to see the numbers on paper go down. As long as you don't sell at this point, they're paper losses. If you start selling now, then you lock in real losses. In fact, this might be a good time to start buying stocks because they're pretty low, and so, which is hard to do. It's hard to pull the trigger when everyone around you is having a fire sale. But at the same time, I would say even for retirees who are in their 50s, 60s, early 70s, your life expectancy, the average life expectancy for a 65-year-old male or female is 20 or 21 years, right? So, President Trump, if he serves all 4 years, that's it's a long but small part of our total future. And if these things are not resolved, if the impact of these tariffs are not resolved by the 2026 elections, I think that there'll be enough of a shakeup politically that'll happen before the next presidential cycle. And this will clearly have, if we have a major recession, this will clearly have an impact on the political makeup of the next 2 and 4 year election. So my view is consume lots of information from lots of sources and be patient. Every dip that we've had, if you look at the COVID dip, I mean, people were losing their minds because the stock market fell so rapidly. And my youngest son and I started, we call it a contrarian trend investment, because we bought stocks in all the stocks that had decent levels and that had dropped quickly. And we bought, small number of shares and lots of different things. And within a year, they had more than doubled. And so, I'm not saying this will happen again within a year this time, because it's very dynamic and involves a lot of other countries, and it's not just finding a vaccine or an inoculation to solve this problem like it was for COVID. But I do think this will be sorted out in the next couple of years, and we just got to kind of have faith and write it out at this point.
Yeah, one other quick follow-up if I could, Nathaniel.
Sure.
One of the reasons why, the issue of tariffs is so attractive is that, as you're aware, we had the Great Migration where my grandfather moved from the South. Millions of other African Americans moved from the South where they were sharecroppers. And, they worked at the various factories, whether it be in my hometown of Akron, where my grandfather and father, he built tires. There are people that went to Detroit to build cars, steel. And so there's a feeling in Gary, Indiana, not far from where Nathaniel was at, had great steel mills. And a lot of people saw those jobs leave, and many of those jobs went overseas. And so, the reason why I think, sometimes the rhetoric is attractive is that, people believe that, hey, if we just raise tariffs, those jobs will come back. Can you kind of, just give us a simple, analysis as to, whether or not, that, layman's viewpoint is correct?
Yeah, I think, this is a really important question. My family and I were discussing this very issue because it, the job dislocations when if you live in a steel company or an auto company town and those jobs go, it has a very intimate, very personal effect and widespread, but within a community living there, right? And one of the things about the economy is that those jobs sometimes disappear. You go to McDonald's today, who gives you the drink? You get it yourself, right? They've used technology to displace who takes your order. You put it in yourself, right? And so, this is the nature of the relationship between capitalists and labor, right? And so part of the steel mill losses and part of the auto losses was shipping jobs to countries where it was cheaper, right? And part of the loss has been because technology has been replacing them. In fact, one of the Trump officials last night was saying, well, this is all going to work great because we're going to have these tariffs and then they're going to rebuild these great plants in America and they'll be all robots. Well, okay. What the heck? If the goal is to have robots replace Chinese and Mexican and Vietnamese workers, then what's in it for the US workers? And so why do we need to bring those jobs back to the United States if there's not going to be any jobs? I think that one of the things that is hard about economics is it is very dynamic, right? And so those steel jobs, those rubber jobs, those car jobs, they change over time, and the composition of who works there changes, and the number of jobs changes, and we have to be somewhat fluid and adaptable. And one of the challenges is how do you prepare workers who lost those jobs through no fault of their own, right? Through no fault of their own, they lost those jobs. And I think that point, as a country, we should come in and offer training and educational opportunities to help move them from one type of industry to another. And so if tire manufacturing is on the way out the door and is being replaced by robotics, then, let's train those workers in how to do some of the robotics and how to do some of the AI programming so that they have meaningful jobs and have continuing education for continuing employment. And I think, you have to look at, the macro economy is very dynamic, but for the individual, you want them to have some income security. You want them to have, the dignity of work, right? That we're not saying, okay, you worked hard for 5 years and now you're unemployable. Well, that's not fair to that person. You know, how do you maintain that person's dignity and their employability by providing them the training that they need for the next job, not the last job? So I think there's an aspect to that. But at the same time, we also have to think about, you know, what are the wraparound services you need in an Akron, in a Gary, in a Detroit, where there are concentrations of jobs that, you know, that were affected by either NAFTA or by, you know, technological change at any given time.
Hey, before we go to the next question, hold on a second. Hey, callers, our phone number today is 833-653-3529. 833-653-3529. Now go ahead, Attorney Banks.
Thank you, Attorney Lee. Professor Rooney, I had another question. I read recently that the United States, that we don't have the infrastructure even to collect all of these tariffs, and that we really only have the capacity to collect approximately 10% of these tariffs. Is this true?
Well, I've not seen that exact number, so my apologies for not. So I can't answer that specific question, but what I can say is that President Trump and Doge, you know, Mr. Musk has been laying off employees at the Internal Revenue Service at a massive rate at a time that we are, you know, providing these new rules and regulations to collect revenues, tax revenues from different sources, as well as at a time when the economy needs the tax revenues. You know, if you drive around Indianapolis, you know, there's a lot of potholes. You know, if you drive to other areas, you know, the roads and bridges need attention. You know, we've seen on the news you know, several of the airports need attention. So we need these tax revenues, and we need the capacity to collect them in an organized manner. So I think there have been a lot of economic studies that have shown every time you add an IRS agent, you have the labor expense, but that the total federal revenue grows by orders of magnitude more than what you pay that person, because they can collect the revenues and they can do audits of people who may not have been paying their fair share of taxes. And so I think this is another area where President Trump is doing something that is ideologically guided and empirically misguided.
Okay, Imhotep, you had a question or comment for us today, one of our callers. Go ahead, sir. You can unmute now. Caller?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Just go ahead.
Hello, yes. All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking my call. Very pertinent and interesting conversation. I appreciate all the expertise from all of you valued guests. We just don't, we're just privileged to have you all. Thank you. A couple things I wanted to point out in my studies throughout all my years. I'm a healthcare professional, but I do have a PLS minor, but I've read incessantly and studied for decades. He talks about the tax revenue. We know through all the studies from whether it's Harvard, Yale, University of Chicago, IU, Kelly, or whatever, that corporations have not paid their fair share of taxes for decades. I mean, for decades. That was one of the main reasons that NAFTA, GATT, CAFTA were signed, not just to get around cheap labor, but to offshore the profits, to quit paying taxes. I just had a debate with a gentleman this morning, and he talked about the same thing about recovering these taxes, this revenue. And I said, okay, well, the revenue was taken off long before now. ExxonMobil, Amazon, Microsoft, I think Tesla, many others have been recorded. They haven't paid any corporate taxes. So he's trying to get around not raising or making corporations pay taxes. When Bill Clinton, this is what I told the gentleman this morning, when Bill Clinton left office, he had a $22 billion surplus because they raised taxes. They raised taxes. So the GOP talking points on getting, this is basically a double taxation, really. And when you look at the research, according to everywhere from Brookings to even the Cato, Conservative Cato Institute and others, the economy is much better for businesses and for workers under Democratic administrations. It's just a known fact, going all the way back post World War II. So if you don't collect money from corporations use the roads too. They use the school. In Canada, corporations have a responsibility to help the school system. It's not based on property. This is the only country where school monies is dictated by property taxes. No other country that happens. I did research on it. It doesn't happen anywhere, not even in China. It doesn't happen that way. The business community has a responsibility to help fund schools and help support schools. That's just not the case here. So as long as we keep allowing the business community to offshore all that money and then don't pay any taxes on it, you're going to continue to see these billionaires amass wealth like they're doing, and then you're going to continue to see the potholes. And last thing, since we brought up the potholes, there's a book out called Field of Schemes. Field of Schemes. A gentleman wrote about close to 20 years ago about the explosion of stadiums and taxpayers paying for these stadiums. Now, there's a few stadiums that the billionaires decided to pay for on their own, but for the most part, if you want to look at around Indianapolis and see why our roads are terrible, look at that stadium downtown. Look at the stadiums all over. Now, Vegas put a visitor's tax and a hotel tax on visitors to pay for their stadium. I think Jerry Jones paid for his all out of his pocket. I think the Mayer family in New York paid about 90% out of their pocket for generally. We've been funding too much of the sports and these billionaires through these stadiums, and we're not getting no ROI. We're not getting return on investment on it. So there's a lot of things there. I mean, it's a deep, deep issue here. But let's just be honest about it. Until the business community uphold their responsibility, pay their fair share of taxes, and we quit funding billionaires' stadiums and things like that and put the money back into the cities where it's supposed to be, we're going to continue to see this problem exacerbate over and over again. And thank you for taking my call.
Well, that was a whole lot. One thing that I could say is that, Professor, I'm sick of these bad roads in Indy, and quite frankly, but one of the things the caller said that hit a nerve with me, right here in Indy, they're doing a special assessment to all the businesses downtown to help eradicate the homeless problem. We have people still in the street, and so it's an important project, I believe, and I donate to that. But here's the problem. All the major corporations downtown pays nothing. So I get a bill for a substantial sum to contribute to this fund, and they've exempt the major corporations like Salesforce and all those corporations. They're not paying anything. And so that caller kind of hit a nerve with me because that is a problem in the sense that they could take the profits and pay huge bonuses to their executive people. I'm not blaming them for that. I'm just saying that I just wish that they pay their fair share just like I do. I pay more property taxes than most of the corporations, the major corporations downtown.
Yeah. No, Nathaniel, I feel your pain. I have a couple of, along the 2 points, the corporate taxes and then the stadiums. So let me make 2 points. And one is that your caller is absolutely correct that many corporations have not paid any corporate income taxes for many years. And so you have something that on paper, nominally, corporations are pay taxes. In reality, very few corporations pay very few taxes. And so how do we get around this in a way that either says we're going to do away with the corporate income tax altogether and replace it with something else that makes sense, or how do you simplify it so there are not all these exemptions and deductions and so on, so that you've got companies that are making billions of dollars and paying zero taxes? And similarly, how do you have individuals like President Trump and Elon Musk who are making billions of dollars and not paying any taxes? I mean, I think we need to reform taxes in a way that they're hitting where they're supposed to, not where they're not supposed to. But I think the issue of the business people who get the taxpayers to pay for the stadiums. There was an article that called this the privatization of profit and the socialization of risk. So, we have two of the wealthiest people in the world own big stadiums and stadia in Indianapolis, right? And we are paying taxes to support them. But I love sports and I'm glad that they're here and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make any more money for me. So I'm paying taxes to support some of the richest people in the state so they make more money. And yet I'm not making, I can watch those games on TV. And so, it doesn't really make sense to me if, the economics of this would say, if those sports franchises are not economically viable on their own, then they shouldn't exist or they shouldn't be here, right? And now no one wants to be the mayor that lost the Colts or lost the Pacers and so on. I get that politically. But at the same time, it's a problem if the smallest taxpayers have to support the richest people for something that doesn't generate very many jobs. The number of full-time jobs generated by professional teams is pretty small. And you've got a few great salaries, and then everyone else is at minimum wage working part-time without health benefits, right? So I think there's that. I think the other comment about businesses funding education, frankly, I'd be happy if they funded anything. We've given them kind of a free pass. And either we need to shift it so that they get a free pass and we can hope they bring the money back from around the world and then reinvest in the United States, or let's tax them in a strategic manner that will actually generate tax revenues that we can use for the roads, the bridges, and the schools in our communities that are so desperately needed.
I have a quick question for you. This kind of really goes to this question about, the supply side economics. I mean, we obviously had Ronald Reagan that came in and said, "Hey, I'm going to reduce the tax rates for the wealthiest people, and this is going to trickle down and increase the economy." And so, the critics of that will say, "Hey, it's caused massive deficits, it's caused inequality." And then those that are proponents will say, "Hey, it's increased the size of the economy." Can you kind of give us a primer on, from your perspective, is there enough data out for us to really have a legitimate critique of supply side economics, and what should we, should we be asking of leaders that want to, double down on supply side economics?
Yeah, so this is not a staged question because we haven't met before, and I wasn't prepared to answer this, but I will tell you a couple things about this because I think this is one of the most intriguing aspects of economics. And what I would say is, at some point, every economist and every business person is a supply sider. And hear me out, because if here is like where we are today, take the middle. If you raise taxes to 90%, just to pick a number, then so that the capitalist only gets 10% of what's produced, there's going to be disincentives for production and hiring and stuff like that, right? So at some point, that person's going to say, well, if you lower taxes, I'm going to increase my activity. And so that's the kind of whole supply side mindset. In fact, President Kennedy, JFK, was the first supply side president. He, most people don't know about that because it happened a long time ago and it wasn't called that then. But he made the same point that if you tax business activity too greatly, you reduce total activity. So he reduced business taxes, to some degree, and we had increase in business activity. President Reagan, made this more of a tautology, that it was true by definition. But what we know empirically is if taxes are too low or if taxes are very low, you can raise taxes and not diminish business activity and generate more tax revenue. So I think it's an empirical thing rather than an ideological thing that you want to be sensitive to raising taxes too much. And I would say, you know, if I'm the producer and I pay 90% taxes and I get 10 cents and the government gets 9 cents, you know, 90% of every dollar, then that's probably not going to be very likely to make me want to make further investments in that, you know, sector, right? But where is that point where I can collect, you know, the government can collect money and I as the producer can collect money and we're both happy. You know, I don't have that exact number, but you know, the average American pays, you know, between 20 and 25% of their income in taxes. That's the average. And we have a lot of people working, right? So, you know, maybe having a flat income tax for households and a flat income tax for corporations at 20 or 25%, and that becomes just kind of normalized, maybe something like that. And I'm picking a number that works empirically, but there might be a better number. But I think something like that. But I think you're absolutely right. We should be sensitive to the fact that supply side as an ideology is right at some point, but it's wrong, empirically wrong at another point. And so now whether, you know, I think a lot of people give JFK credit for making that first move and give President Reagan credit as well. But I think as long as you have lots of loopholes and credits and deductions, and you know, and I'll say I use TurboTax every year, and I try to minimize my taxes legally and try to figure out, you know, well, should I make this additional donation or, you know, making sure I get my property tax deduction and so on. But at the same time, you know, I'd rather make money and pay taxes than not make money and not pay any taxes. And so I think, you know, as a society, we've got to balance those incentives for the producers and for the workers to be productive and to make money and to pay taxes. And so, you know, in any discussion of supply side, I think we have to think about, you know, supply of capital and supply of labor, and then the demand for the two, demand for capital and demand for labor. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes,
And
yes.
thank you.
Attorney Baker, you have another question? Well,
Not,
here,
not at this particular time. I was going to note the fact that we're seeing across the nation today, under the title of hands-off rallies and protests, peaceful protests that have been scheduled across the nation. There are over 1,000 protests that have been scheduled across the country, and these are mass mobilization rallies that are aimed to protest against some of the administration's policies and the Musk Doge actions. In fact, in Indianapolis, I read that there is a rally that's anticipating up to 1,000 citizens, Attorney Lee. Have you heard about that?
I apologize. I've been in jury trial prep.
Been sequestered for.
What happens is that when I have these jury trials, you know, you do depositions, you're working late at night, and when I saw the market crashing, then I just work harder.
I understand. I understand.
Dr. Roon was talking about this market meltdown. It's a real thing because, you know, I've worked my whole life and I've set aside money for pensions, things like that. Then I watch the value dropped by about 25% in like
Mhm.
a week time period.
Exactly.
So I feel sorry for those folks who have retired and now have to live off their pension because they just lost about 20-25% of their value within the last month. It looks like it's going to get worse. And so,
Before it gets better.
yeah,
Right.
you got the problem now is that you have ongoing expenses every month. You have to pay bills. Even if you did appropriate plan for retirement, you didn't plan for this.
Right.
So you could set aside money. You could have a preset amount that you withdraw, like a lot of my clients. And all of a sudden, it's going to be a deficit because you can't take that amount out now because if you did, it lowers your stock holding. As a result, when the market goes up, now it's going to be a really big loss. So mathematically, if your stock you bought it for $100, it went up to 150, now it dropped down to 80, you can't sell the stock, so you can't get money out. And then at insult to injury, I read that there's some potential disruption of Social Security payment. One of the things I'm concerned about for all you listeners, I know this is a big deal. A lot of my friends, they're receiving Social Security checks. Then we find out that that agency may have some delay in making benefit payment. I have a lot of clients, Marlon, Vanita, Dr. Rooney, that relies on that check every month. And so when I see this tariff, this uproar with the stock market, and then at the same time, if you have a small amount of money in your pension account, you can't get that out. I'm really concerned that this direction is going to be just so detrimental to so many folks but the question, what can be done to fix this problem?
I think one of the
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the, I think you're absolutely right, Nathaniel, because, and Dr. Rooney can surely speak to this issue. The percentage of people that are getting straight pensions has dramatically declined. I mean, you're talking, 10, 13%. I'm one of the fortunate ones that's drawing a pension. But to your point, even those that do get a pension, a part of your retirement package is what's in your 401k. And I know that's for federal retirees as well as other retirees as well. So you're absolutely right. You could, be responsible, do all the right things. And hey, one stool of it is of your payments is this pension. And then another big stool of it is, what you were able to put away in your 401k. And then the other stool is Social Security. And so if any one of those stools gets disrupted, I mean, certainly that caused a problem in terms of, your individual ability to meet your financial expenses.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because when Social Security was created, they said it was to be one of three stools, right? One was the government sector helping hold up an amount of money that was not meant to be your entire retirement amount, but it was something to supplement it. And then a pension from your employer, and then your personal savings. So that was supposed to be the triad, the three legs of the stool. But for many people, for whatever circumstances, their corporations, stopped producing pensions and they have 401ks or they don't. And, there's no requirement to have retirement accounts and there's no, and some of them have had their retirement accounts rated. And so there's not the money there that had been planned or promised. And many people through, a variety of life circumstances haven't been able to save properly for their own personal retirements. And so we see an excessive reliance on Social Security and and the swings with that. And I think, not to be conspiratorial, but I think one of the things with, we've heard about Elon Musk cutting the number of jobs in Social Security offices and reducing the ability to make phone calls and go online and do things remotely. Their effort was to cut down on fraud and so on, allegedly. But what that does is it reduces the availability of services, which then, if you move or change your checking account information and so on, then you've got to go into the office. Well, that does reduce fraud, but If you can't drive anymore, or if you're handicapped and have difficulty maneuvering yourself to a downtown office, and there's fewer of those, and they're open for fewer hours, and there's fewer employees, that's saving the administration some money, but it will create great impositions for individuals. And so that affects their ability to collect their Social Security checks. And that ripples through because that causes further anxiety about how they're going to survive for themselves, but also their children and grandkids and others who feel responsible for them. And so I think that these things are related. And I, I think in general, Elon Musk called Social Security a Ponzi scheme, but it's something that's, it has been this way since time immemorial. It was always created that, people paid in every year and other people got paid out, got benefits, right? And one generation takes care of the next generation. So, it's not a Ponzi scheme as we think of a Ponzi scheme and the prejudice around that, right? In the ideal world, we would have started a Social Security system when the very first worker started, and they would have self-funded their first, their own retirement, and that would have just continued. But life didn't play out that way. And so Social Security was created to help bridge these gaps, and people who are still working, helping those who are retired, so that the people who are retired could have dignity in their retirement and survivability in their retirement, even though the economies may have been dislocated from when they were originally working. And so I think that, part of this for Musk and President Trump and so on is an antipathy towards government in general, and also a desire to create a distrust in the government by providing reduced services, less predictable services, less predictable payments, and then, yeah, Social Security is not working, so we better do away with it. I think this is not impossible as a part of that strategy. And so I think that we need to be careful as a society to react to the facts and the figures and the intentions. I think the intentions matter in these things.
Attorney Banks?
What excellent points, Dr. Rooney. One of the things that I'm seeing is that, to be able to defend our democracy, people have to be able to believe in it, right? And I think
Yes,
this is an intentional destabilization of the United States government in all the ways that you just stated, right? The purpose of the government is to support people. But if you create the inability for the government, for example, you use Social Security, when you close offices, when you say you have to come in, you create this kind of chaos. It leads people to think, to your point, that government can't work for Americans. And so to defend democracy, we have to believe in it, but to believe in it, we have to understand it. And so there's a great need for education in our nation at this point, that there are three branches of government, right? And that the Congress has the power of the purse, right?
right,
And that the courts are to interpret the law. What we're seeing is this concept of a unitary presidency that's playing out as we're seeing it. And so you have to ensure, to Attorney Prime's point, that people have access to information so they can understand these things.
right.
And so I'm seeing people beginning to wake up. I was very encouraged by the 25-hour speech that Senator Cory Booker delivered a few days ago. And we are seeing these peaceful, I emphasize, protests across our nation, with citizens showing up at their congressional offices to speak against these, many of which are illegal, unconstitutional, executive orders. We had never seen executive orders be used for in this way, from my perspective, in the history of our nation.
Oh, well, we're at the end of our time for our show today. This is an important discussion. Unfortunately, we didn't get into any solution today. We talked about this, so maybe we have to talk about this next week. But I'd like to thank all our listeners, our superstar panel today. And this subject is so important that we have to spend more time. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. So I'd like to thank everybody for calling in today. Sorry we can get to all our callers. And I'd like to thank our superstar panel. Until then, God bless and keep you, and we'll be back.